Hello, this is the Tavana course, Standards for Free and Fair Elections. My name is Andrew Blick. I am lecturer in Politics and Contemporary History, King's College London, and Director of History and Policy. I was the first research fellow to the first ever parliamentary inquiry in the UK, looking at the idea of whether or not the UK should introduce a written constitution. I study constitutional history and democratic development in the UK and have worked with a number of democratic assessment and reform groups around the world in countries including Pakistan, Ukraine and Turkey. Please watch this lecture before the relevant live discussion session. Also, after the lecture and in advance of the session, as required reading, please read a short paper I wrote for a Pakistan-based democratic reform group entitled Democratic Development in Perspective. That's available online to download. This lecture is about the historic development of elections. It will look at issues including the development of the theory and practice of elections, how they were introduced and spread around the world, what obstacles have been faced by advocates of elections, how these obstacles have been overcome, what reform movements actually achieved. The overall idea will be to give an overall perspective on how these things change, that once nowhere in the world was democratic, the idea of democracy didn't really exist, but that it gradually took hold, partly by completely unpredictable circumstances in particular parts of the world, and that gains were achieved, but that it was a long drawn out process, and often progress was followed by setbacks. Just to give an overall flavour of what those who seek to achieve democratic improvement are actually facing, the challenge but also the opportunities that are involved. Famously, the idea of democracy, rule of the people, as it translates from ancient Greek, began in ancient Greece. As I've said in a previous lecture, Greek democracy was in some ways quite different to democracy as understood in the contemporary world. It didn't involve an expansive franchise. It wasn't an inclusive concept of democracy. It was a small group within the society that actually had full citizenship rights and was able to take part in democracy. Women were certainly excluded, slaves were certainly excluded. It was a small group of privileged males who were actually able to take part. Nevertheless, the idea that they would be voting, and this is where voting comes in, which is important from the point of view of elections, the idea that they were able to vote and take decisions was important and was radical, was regarded as a challenge from the point of view of other kinds of systems. So democracy has this origin, and as I said last week, it's a different kind of democracy in the sense that it was direct democracy. Today we have the thing called representative democracy. In ancient Greece, it was direct democracy that they had, that people actually took part in the decisions themselves on a regular basis, rather than electing people to take part in, to take those decisions on their behalf. So insofar as there's been a key historic transition in the concept of democracy, it's that elections as we understand them today have come to the fore, have come to be the critical facilitator of democracy. So rather than direct democracy processes, voting on specific decisions taken with the whole electorate, with whatever that electorate is taking part, it's actually elections to office that are critical in a representative democracy and go a long way towards making that representative system genuinely democratic. So that's an important historic transition, but the idea of voting, a system that involves voting, does have origins in ancient Greece. It went away again after that, but it was there as a model. It could be returned to, it could be looked at. There was seen as being faults in the system, but they're also seen as being strengths, and the general underlying principle of rule of the people was there. Now the rule of the people in a democracy tends to be exercised via elections, which is why elections are so important to the democratic system. When we move on historically to the emergence of democracy as we understand it today, we really tend to look to the 19th century for what is known as the first wave of democratization. Historians of democratic development often refer to these waves, that there were three, perhaps more, periods in which democratization occurred not just in one country, but in a series of countries across different parts of the world, that there was some kind of interconnected phenomenon at these points in history. And always critical to those waves is the election process, the use of elections as a means of ensuring that a society is more democratic. Elections were taking place long before the 19th century, but they were limited in important ways. One way in which they are limited was the size of the franchise, that there wasn't universal or near universal inclusion of the people in the electoral process. It might be only a very small group, perhaps of males, perhaps fulfilling particular religious requirements, and also perhaps fulfilling particular property requirements, that you had to actually have a certain degree of wealth to be considered worthy of having a stake in the system in order that you would be allowed to vote. This was certainly the case in my country, in the United Kingdom, well into the 19th century, that there were property limitations, there were gender restrictions, there were sometimes religious restrictions as well on voting. These are the limitations. So this was one limitation which shows that elections aren't necessarily democratic. If the franchise is heavily limited, it's very hard to say you've got a democratic electoral system. So that was one thing that had to change significantly before you can really talk about a country taking part in a wave of democratization. What else has to change significantly? Well, what has to happen is the election, as I've talked about in the previous lecture, has to actually mean something. Again, to look at my country, for a long while, for many centuries, we have a parliament, part of which is elected. The House of Commons is a chamber of the parliament which is elected, going back to the Middle Ages, going back over many centuries. Elected, admittedly, on a limited franchise, but elected nonetheless. But there was a problem with this, in that the House of Commons didn't necessarily always have the power that it needed to actually determine what policy would be. And it would be other unelected groups unelected institutions, unelected office holders that might have the real power and might be able to frustrate the will of the House of Commons. For instance, the second chamber of the UK Parliament, the House of Lords, was and remains unelected. It is not elected, and historically the House of Lords has been more powerful than it is now. So there you have an unelected second chamber which was at times able to frustrate the elected first chamber. There is also the issue of the monarch, an unelected head of state. Again, up to the present day, our monarch, presently Queen Elizabeth II, is unelected. Therefore, in times where the monarch had real political power, this was a problem. It meant that the election to the House of Commons wasn't as meaningful as it might have been. So for a country like the UK to join in a wave of democratisation, two things had to happen. The franchise had to expand, property qualifications had to be relaxed, gender restrictions had to be removed, those kind of things had to happen. And also, elections had to mean something. The House of Commons had to become the most powerful entity in the UK political system. It had to be the basis for the formation of governments. So we don't really start to get really serious movement on both those fronts into the 19th century, when the UK, some would say, starts to really become a democracy. Now, in fact, it was not until 1928 in the UK that we have an equal universal franchise, that people aren't discriminated against on the basis of property qualifications. Women get the vote at the same age as men. That doesn't come until 1928. So the general election of 1929 is probably the first fully democratic election in the history of the United Kingdom. So these processes can take a long while. By this point also, the House of Commons had, for probably more than 100 years, clearly become the dominant political force at UK level, so that in electing a House of Commons under this expanded franchise, you're also in effect determining who was going to form the government, and you're electing a body that could hold that government to account. So that's an example of how complicated the change can be, and that you need to have multiple developments. You need to have elections being meaningful. You need to have the franchise being expanded. And then not as much of a problem in the UK, but in other countries, another issue has been elections have to actually be competitive. There has to be more than one group or party actually contesting those elections, preferably with at least a theoretical chance of winning. Therefore, systems where you had more equivalence to one-party states, for instance, as effectively you had in some of the communist states up to the 1980s, those were problematic from a democratic point of view, because although elections might take place, there might be a wide franchise. Nonetheless, only one party was able to run, or certainly only one party was able to seriously contest the election, and that meant, again, there were limitations on attaining some of these core principles of democracy. So this spread of democracy has been very gradual, but there have been these waves. There was the first wave they referred to, began in the first half of the 19th century. Some would call that the long wave, and would say that carried on into a period after the end of the First World War. And countries taking part in that wave include countries like Britain, France, the United States, some British colonies. After the First World War, some of the countries which lost the First World War, such as Germany, Russia for a brief period, were involved in the First World War and had to strike a peace deal with Germany. Some of those countries then after the First World War do become more democratic. They move towards a more democratic electoral system. However, after this first wave, you get a kind of period of regression that some of the states which became democratic then moved back away from democracy. The Soviet Union certainly soon becomes clearly a less than democratic state. Germany in the 1930s, under the Nazi regime of Adolf Hitler, removes its democratic constitution and becomes a dictatorship. So we see movement in the other direction. Countries like Italy as well have moved away from democracy. So the first wave is followed by a kind of period of backsliding and democratic reversal. Then after the Second World War, we get a shorter second wave of democratization. Countries like Germany, Japan, Italy, which lost the Second World War, have democratic systems introduced into them. Former colonies like India, former British colony, become independent and also attempt to adopt democratic systems. So this is the second wave after the end of the Second World War in 1945. Again, that's followed by a period in the 1950s and 60s of backsliding, countries becoming less democratic, countries moving away from democratic systems, such as Pakistan, former British colony, previously part of the overall Indian possession, moving away from democracy. So there's a second period of backsliding. And during this period, there's a lot of discussion by observers of democratic development that there are some serious limitations on democracy, that maybe democracy is only something for Europe. In fact, some suggested it was only something really for northwestern Europe. Some observers said really the only countries that are suited to democracy are those that have the Protestant religion, particular variant of Christianity. So you could have democracy, say, in the United States of America, although it wasn't in Europe, it had clear cultural and historical links to Europe. You could have democracy in Britain, you could have democracy in Sweden, for instance, but they felt that countries, even countries that were predominantly Catholic, like Spain, Greece, Portugal, were not suited to democracy. And beyond the European or European-linked world, beyond the Christian world, it's felt to be even more difficult that you could actually have some kind of democratic system. Then events of the 1970s began to call such theories into question. In the 1970s, you get again another wave of democratization known as the third wave of democratization. Starts out in southern Europe, in the Catholic countries people thought couldn't be democratic, starts in places like Spain, Portugal, Greece, spreads to Latin America, spreads to Asia, spreads to the communist world, the collapse of the Soviet Union early in the 1990s is important to this, spreads to parts of Africa as well. So there's a really powerful wave of democratization from the 1970s onwards, and it reaches places that was previously believed couldn't really properly adapt to democracy. Roman Catholic countries, also countries like Taiwan, where Confucianism is practiced, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, with Confucianism, countries where it was believed, again, democracy for cultural reasons couldn't really take. And yet democracy did manage to make progress in those places. Some people believe that the third wave continued into this century, into the 21st century, where you see the coloured revolutions take place in the first decade of the 21st century in former Soviet republics such as Ukraine, and then also in 2011 the Arab Spring begins in Tunisia, spreads across the region. Now again, often this third wave is accompanied at times by backsliding. Some of the gains that are made are lost. For some people, the Arab Spring didn't work out as might have been hoped when it was first beginning. In some of the former Soviet states, there's been backsliding away from democratic principle. So it's never an irresistible movement in one particular direction, but it is interesting to note that there are these periods in history where democratization takes place, and at the center of it all are elections. Elections are always critical. If we're going to understand democracy, we have to understand the holding of elections, and elections are central to this purpose of democratization. Again, it involves that elections have to mean something. They have to involve actually electing a body which has real power. There has to be competition in those elections, and the franchise has to be wide. So in trying to attain these things, these meaningful elections where there's a genuine choice, we need to know how long and protracted this historical process can be, and that often progress is accompanied by setbacks. When we consider finally the ideas of what drives democratization, what drives the securing of democratic elections, there are a number of different factors at play. Some people point to economic factors. They say you'll not get a system with meaningful elections until you have economic modernization. It's not always clear what economic modernization means, but often they say you're not going to have a system that works properly until you actually get this economic base in place. That's what drives it. Some people say it's social forces, that you need a powerful middle class, or that maybe you need an organized working class, that's what drives a process. It creates demand for meaningful elections. These groups insist on having some kind of stake in the system, and until you get those groups appearing and being powerful, you're never going to have a successful democratic electoral system. Another argument is that education is incredibly important, that people have to actually learn, they have to have knowledge, they have to have literacy, they have to have awareness of ideas and different systems before you can actually have a meaningful and successful democratic electoral system. Some people, as I've already suggested, refer to religious and cultural factors. They say certain kinds of society can't actually properly manage an election. They're not compatible with competitive elections. As I said, religion often figures in that, and there have been arguments over the years that Islam is very difficult to reconcile with democratic principles. Others argue actually it's a very democratic system if you look at its core values, but that debate goes on. But there have been some examples of countries that do have Islam within them, but have been able to be democratic. And the example most commonly cited there is Indonesia, which from the late 20th century in particular made an impressive transition to a more democratic system. So in that sense, the argument, the cultural religious argument, is undermined. There are often exceptions to rules, so it means that defeat is never inevitable and that there are ways forward. When we consider what kind of factors might help to achieve progress, those people who want elections to be more democratic, who want to campaign, who want to achieve more democratic systems, one useful thing to work with is this. In systems that aren't democratic but take on some of the trappings of a democracy, by which I mean elections that aren't fully satisfactory, but are elections of some kind nonetheless, and maybe other features of democratic system. In those kind of systems, although at first the use of an election is actually an excuse for democracy, not real democracy, it can create a desire for something more. It might create a scenario in which the authorities are not fully in control of what goes on, and people may find that because they're being asked to vote, they start to think, and the actual event of an election can create opportunities for campaigns, for demands for reform. So elections can create a taste for more. They can create a culture in which elections are expected and which people maybe then demand that they become more truly democratic. And it can also provide an opportunity, a moment for campaign and a focus for outside interest. I talk about this international community of democracy and these international waves of democratization. Securing successful democratic elections is not something which happens in a vacuum. Outside people are looking in, outside forces can influence what goes on inside. That it's never going on in a vacuum. Therefore, elections are an important way of linking up to these outside, these wider forces that can actually help bring about more effective democratic elections. All of those points are crucial, and I suppose what's most important of all is that there are forces within any given country that are actually pressing for reform, that are continually looking at what's wrong and seeing what can be done to improve it. And that's a crucial thing to work with. So the mere existence of people who want change is the most important thing of all, and history has certainly taught us that lesson. Thank you.